My name is John Kendall, and I'm on the Sloan Research Papers team. And it is my pleasure to present to you our presenters, Andrew and Adi, and they'll be presenting Boastgusters, real-time interactive play sketching with synthesized NBA defenses. The presentation will last about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards for about 5 minutes. And during the Q&A session, just raise your hand, and we will bring to you the microphone. And now, please join me in welcoming our presenters, Andrew and Adi.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aditya, and this is my colleague, Andrew, and we're here to present our work on real-time interactive play sketching with synthesized NBA defenses. And I'm sure you're wondering why we chose the name Boastgusters. Let me assure you that it's not a typo. As you can probably guess, we had something slightly different in mind, but it was trademarked. So the reasoning behind this name is going to become a little more obvious as the talk goes on. So let's go. The last 5-6 years has seen widespread growth in sports analytics, with a lot of the top-notch work presented at this conference. People have studied shooting patterns, used analytics to better understand the fundamentals of the game in rebounding and ball screens. Some of the more recent work has led analytics to become a lot more fine-grained. One key work that I'd like to point out here is data-driven ghosting, where the objective of the work was to generate these fine-grained defensive simulations for offensive tracking data. And these simulated defenders were called ghosts. The one common that's there across all of this work is that although it provides a wealth of amazing information, all of it can either be used pre-game for planning and scouting purposes, and post-game for to analyze player and team performance. But what about courtside? Now just imagine that the Celtics are down by 2 with 5 seconds left in the fourth quarter of a clutch playoff game. Where's the analytics? Current analytical tools provide little to no insight into these heat-of-the-moment in-game decisions. So now the obvious question here is, how do we actually integrate some of the amazing analytics that I just talked about into these in-game decisions courtside in an easy-to-use fashion? And Boastgusters is the answer to that. Boastgusters is an intelligent sketching interface that allows a coach to intuitively sketch out a play just like they would on a regular clipboard. And now, once you can sketch out this play, what we actually do is we convert that sketch into tracking data by extracting the implicit timing information within it. And this allows you to do a few cool things. Firstly, you can actually just animate that sketch just to kind of better understand what the play entails and what is expected. But more importantly, you can now bring back all of that analytics, which was in the back office, on court side, real time, to see how your defenders are likely to respond, to see if your play can actually bust the ghosts.
So Adi introduced you guys to Boastgusters, and we're going to spend the rest of our talk here kind of looking under the hood, understanding how this works and what it's built on top of. I'm going to walk us through improved ghosting models. And so these are multi-agent models that are able to hallucinate or synthesize context-specific, team-specific defensive behavior. And then Adi will walk us through this sketching interface and how it lets us utilize these complex models courtside and visualize the wisdom they have to share. So when I talk about ghosting, I want to tell you a bit about how we construct these models and highlight some of the key design points that are applicable across team sports. We can show you some of the nuanced basketball behaviors that they're able to produce. And then finally talk about why these models are trustworthy, why a coach should give them some credence, why they belong as part of our game. So the origin story for ghosting really goes back to 2013. And the Toronto Raptors had a really innovative project. They decided, we want to get better on the defensive side of the ball. And so we're going to use all this trajectory data. We're going to use all this sports view tracking data. And we're going to go through frame by frame and look at each player and say, OK, I know where you were, but where should you have been? And so the back office staff did this, and it took a really long time. But they came up with a tool that they could show their coaches and their players, and so that they could visualize when they were systematically out of position. There's a couple big problems here. This takes a huge amount of time. It's also somewhat subjective or inconstant, right? Humans are doing the labeling. So an alternative to this is something called data-driven ghosting. And so this was presented at this conference last year, and the idea was rather than using humans to label where everyone should have been, we just leverage all the existing trajectory data and say where were defenders typically. And it passes the sniff test, right? You get reasonable-looking behavior, and you see nice things. Like if you only train your models using examples from good defensive teams, you get better defensive ghosts. There's some really important limitations of this work, however, that sort of prevent it from being a courtside tool. The ghosts in last year's work lacked any kind of key contextual information. And what I mean by that is that you play defense differently based on your own history in game, right? Like, I'm going to be a little less hustle after 44 minutes on the court than I am at the beginning of the game, but also based on the game state, right? The score differential, how much time is left, what the shot clock's at. Additionally, all of those ghosts before were restricted to playing against past historical data. We could ask, what other defenses would have done against that play that happened last week. We weren't able to ask what-if questions about the future. Finally, these were big statistical models that lived on servers. They weren't something we could put on the sideline, right? There's no spot on the bench. So our ghosting models are built on something called contextual imitation learning. And I want to highlight 4 key things that are important for applying this across team sports. The biggest one is data sufficiency. You're training models by little examples. They're seeing these examples and they're trying to imitate them. And so we need lots of teaching examples. And here basketball is great, right? A game has 200 possessions, 82 games. We have a lot of data. Everything we're going to show you here was trained on 30,000 possessions from the 2016-17 NBA season. Now you have all that data. You have to route it to these different defender models intelligently. You got to make sure you're representing the world in a way that allows these models to kind of learn these behaviors. And finally, your underlying architecture has to have the capacity to perform all these complex and intricate team actions. So we talked about where our data is coming from. Let's talk about data routing. Basketball is a fluid game, and players are constantly switching positions. A really key component to getting realistic behavior is routing the data, these teaching examples, not based on the position that's on sort of the box score sheet, but on the defensive role that player is playing at that time. So, if we have a model that's for the center, that's in ghosting terms, that's the model for the person who's playing the defensive role under the basket, right? So if that happens to be your shooting guard on this possession, that example has to go to that, rim protector model. This allows each of these models to develop a unique kind of defensive identity and also to learn relationships between one another. The actual data that we're routing, there's a lot of freedom we have here in how we represent the world. And we make a couple of choices that give our models the ability to learn about basketball and not all the other stuff. And so what I mean by that is every player's position we represent in an over-complete way. And so that means that, instead of just X, Y, we also have the distance and angle to relevant things like the ball and the basket. Basically, 10th grade geometry was hard for some of us, and it's definitely hard for deep neural networks. And so if we can do all the geometry ahead of time, then the model can pick and choose what's relevant for what kind of questions. Additionally, basketball, like all sports, local information has a special prevalence, right? I'm most concerned with the man I'm guarding. A pick and roll happens very close around me. And so we append the closest players again. We kind of copy it a second time at the end of the vector so that the models can always look in the same place to find what's happening locally. Finally, we include these player and game-specific context features. So at the player level, we say, how long have you been on the court? How many fouls do you have? Things like this. And for the game state, we talk about shot clock, game clock, score differential. Okay, so finally we come to this last point, which is sort of the model capacity or the model architecture. And there's two key points I want to leave you with. First of all, these have to be deep in structure. They need to have multiple layers. Basketball behaviors happen on many different timescales. There are fast reactions and there's long-term planning. And so we need a deep structure to be able to capture all those timescales. Additionally, when we're training these models, we need to allow them to roll out deep in time. And that means we're not correcting them at every time step. We let them sort of hallucinate for a full second before we pin them back to what they should have been. And this is important because it gives them that human-like quality of being able to anticipate future actions and to recover from missteps. So what does all of this get us? I mean, I went through the design choices, but what do we actually see? And at a first pass, we see the nuanced sort of atomic basketball behaviors that we associate with NBA defense. So I'm going to show you a couple examples. In all the cases, the red dots are real offensive trajectories. And the blue dots are, ghosts that have been synthesized by our models. It's important to note that our models have never seen any of these offensive trajectories before. These are not part of our training set. So we see that our defenders leave their man to help protect the baseline, to help, essentially they play help defense, prevent easy layups. We see them go over screens. They have no idea that they actually take up space, and yet they fight over screens to stay glued to shooters. They close out hard on the three-point line, particularly in the corner, right? And there's even a level of court awareness that, hey, the ball handler's right by the half-court line. I have an opportunity to force a backcourt violation. I'm going to apply some extra pressure in this moment. So all of these atomic behaviors are really important, right? But they're not sufficient. All of these have to happen in the right context, right? That high pressure at the half-court line might happen early in the game, but not after we've logged 44 minutes. How hard I close out on a shooter depends on what team I'm playing, how many fouls I have, all of these different elements. And so to give you a kind of toy example of what we mean by context-dependent behaviors and the way our models pick up on that, we take this toy example of a player driving to the hoop, right? We can pick a defender. We're going to pick the on-ball defender here. And we can say, hey, you haven't been on the court for 4 minutes. You've been on the court for 44 minutes, right? And so learning from examples of NBA players who have been on the court for a really long time, that player is no longer able to keep up with the ball handler and drops off. But you can also see that basketball is a team game, and his teammates have learned to start filling in that void. Okay, so this is just another kind of fun example. We asked, hey, what would happen if you took defenses from the 2013 season and played them against a defense from today, from the 2017 season? And so the really light gray circles are 2013, and the darker circles are their 2017 compatriots. And you can see that defenses today are much more concerned with the three-point line, pinching in and compressing the space than they were 4 years ago. Okay, so recap. We've showed you these high-level context-dependent behaviors. And I want to make a fairly bold claim that we're able to produce trajectories that are nearly indistinguishable from real player tracking data. Okay? And so we have a little Turing test here, which is we have 4 8-second plays here. In every case, the red dots are real offensive trajectory data. Your job as the audience is to decide which of the defensive players, whether it's the Thunder, Celtics, Pistons, or Warriors, is real defensive trajectory data, and which are generated by our ghosting models. I know it's a lot to take in. We'll kind of go frame by frame here. Okay? So the Thunder here, are they real defenders? Is this real data from a game? Or are these generated by our model? What about the Celtics? Or the Pistons? Or the Warriors? Okay, one last look. Everybody got sort of a vote in their mind? Okay, all of these, except for the Boston Celtics, were generated by our model. Okay? All right, so it passes the eye test, or I hope I've convinced you of that. But we want to bring this courtside. We want to bring this in-game, right? Which means that the trust factor is huge. It means that we need to know exactly what kind of mistakes we make going forward into the future, if we make mistakes, which you're going to, you're predicting the future, and whether or not we're accurately representing the defensive behavior we expect to see. In a word, we need to do analytics on our analytics. And so we took ghost trajectories and player trajectories, and we put them through an expected points model. And we see nearly identical traces through the expected points throughout a possession. And this means that our on-ball defense is functionally equivalent, okay? A player may be a step or two off on the other side of the court, but around the ball, we're getting extremely high fidelity behavior. Additionally, we train these guys over 1 second windows. When we stretch out 6, 8 seconds into the future, the error doesn't explode. Furthermore, basketball is great in the sense that the points at which the ghosts know, or the signals about what the defense and the ghost should do are the strongest, are exactly the important ones, mostly around screens and shot opportunities. Finally, we're working on a host of methods like ensemble averages that let us drive the error down even lower.
No, this is cool. Now we've seen this in-depth work into how these ghosting models were built, and why you should actually trust these results, why these results are accurate, but that's only half the battle. We still need a way to actually interact with these models, and more importantly, we're still very far from actually bringing it courtside. So what gets us courtside? There are 3 constraints that we're kind of working with here. One is the constraint from the coach, in a sense that you should have 0 barrier to entry. This tool should be just as easy to use as sketching on paper or on a regular whiteboard. And the second thing is that we built this amazing analytics backend, but it only requires tracking data. So now how do you convert this sketch to look like NBA-like trajectory data? And thirdly, it needs to be something that's intuitive and runs on a tablet. You're not going to have your analytics staff and your coders sitting on the bench helping you out during a timeout to actually use this tool. So what do we mean when we say 0 barrier to entry? The Boastcaster sketching interface has to be something that's so easy to use and so similar to what coaches are already used to that it makes them actually want to switch to this digital domain. And the Boastcaster sketching interface is actually, since it's a smart tool, it can automatically identify ball movement and infer whether a particular segment is actually a pass, or it's being dribbled, or it's being shot. This, if anything, makes it easier to sketch on Boastcasters. So now that we know that our analytics backend requires this tracking data, how do we actually generate tracking data from the sketch? The naive approach to that is to actually linearly sample player and ball trajectories from start to finish. But what you get from that is something that's infeasible, doesn't satisfy any of the causal constraints in the sense that the ball needs to be with the player as he's dribbling it, passes and shots need to be received and made at the appropriate time. The advantage is that given that we know these causal constraints exist, what we can do is actually treat our trajectories as segments, a dribble segment, pass, screens, and moves or shots. And now, what we can actually do is we can linearly sample player and ball trajectories within each segment to get something that's actually a lot more feasible and looks a lot more like NBA tracking data. Now that we actually have the tracking data, let's go back to the question at hand. The Boston Celtics are 2 points down in a clutch playoff game, and Brad Stevens draws out an end-of-game set, which he calls the winner, that generates an open 3-point shot after a couple of screens. Now we know exactly how this play is going to look, and most importantly, given that we know that it's a first-round playoff game against the Chicago Bulls, we can now see exactly what the Chicago Bulls are likely to do given this play. And now the cool thing with this, with Boastcasters, is that it's not restrictive in nature in the sense that you every time have to sketch out a new play. What you can actually do is import plays from existing tracking data and literally just scribble out the segments that you don't want, draw out new trajectories, and you have a new play altogether. And now what you can do is you can actually generate the defensive response to this new sketch and see which one actually works better for the given situation. Before I finish off, I'd like to thank my dream team of co-authors. And we've had a lot of fun doing this work. Please visit us at our poster. We have a couple of iPads and Apple Pencils for you guys to actually play around with Ghostbusters. So thank you so much.
That's good. Awesome job. Thanks. It was great.
And now it's time for the Q&A. We'll bring the microphone to those that have questions.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering how you took into account the different team defenses. For example, in the different sketches you showed, like the way Boston covers the pick and roll, they'll hedge out, and then they won't switch. The guy will go back to the other player. So how does that get taken into account in the creation of these defensive ghosts?
Yeah, so when we talk about those contextual features, what team the data originates from is one of those contextual features. And the model does something smart, which is that to learn what Boston does, it doesn't only take Boston data points, but it begins to map out what data points are like Boston, and it learns most from those examples. So you begin to associate actual trajectories and behavior with those team IDs.
Hi.
Yep.
Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, in the examples that you've shown, it looks like the team on the offense always ends up making a shot and getting the points, basically. Are there examples where the defense actually prevents the play from finishing?
Do you mean with the sketching aspect or just ghosting in general?
Sketching and then ghosting to see that, okay, that play actually has a high likelihood of not being successful.
Okay, so given that we've actually taken the sketch and converted it to tracking data, this is not something that's reactive in nature. So it's going to run that play no matter what. And you can the key insight here is to identify situations that the defense is doing things that actually make sense and things that don't, to kind of identify how your team is likely to respond. So if you know that you're going to run a screen to make your shooter free, if you can see that the defense is going over the screen as opposed to under the screen, that allows you to prepare for that situation a little better.
Thank you.
First of all, thanks guys, great job. I was trying to think of, for an example, when you're drawing up a play at the end of a game, so much of it from a defensive standpoint relies on kind of the field of vision of the defender. So when you're drawing up a play, you want to obviously confuse the defense and do something that's conducive to you scoring. And part of that is kind of throwing off their field of vision. Is there any way the system accounts for that currently, or is that something that's too far down the line? You're unable to kind of track where a defender's looking, because if you're setting a back screen and he's coming back, just from visually you can't see where the defender's looking, but if he's looking at the guy setting the screen versus the guy making the backdoor cut, that obviously makes a big difference in the outcome. So is there any way that the system currently tracks that, or is that in the plans for down the line?
So the data we have coming in is sort of trajectory XY data, like centers of mass. And there's a lot of cool things we can do once that expands. Like when we start talking about the pose of the player, where their arms are, where their legs are. But when you talk about, do you get sort of realistic behavior, when I first realized that these models were doing something very cool was when I saw a ghost die on a screen. And I'm like, okay, this doesn't have any physical volume, but it's seen examples of getting hit by a back screen, and it knows that NBA players just stop there, right? And so you will see ghosts respond or die on a screen when it's set up in a context that it's seen before. But no, we're not explicitly modeling field of view. We don't have that data as to train on.
Hi. First of all, good job. Very interesting stuff. So it's very helpful for coaches to be able to do like this kind of what-if analysis, right? Like draw a play out. Is there a second step maybe where you can kind of recommend the best option?
So can we put something back up here? Because we have
So the thing is, yes, you can do that, and there are a few ways that you can do that. One of the easiest ways that we like to do it is you can see what the expected points is going to be for a certain play that you run out. If it's not as good as what you want, you can then change the sketch in order to generate situations that.
But are you able to generate perhaps a play that a coach doesn't even give you, but like the coach says this is the situation, and then can the program itself recommend a movement, or?
The program's not going to come up with plays for you, but you can like run a play and then test it against different defenses and score it by like how likely it is to produce a good shooting opportunity. So you can do something like that.
That concludes our Q&A session. Please join me in thanking our presenters.